Dr. Katherine Chavigny is, let me start over. Dr. Katherine Chavigny earned her PhD in history from the University of Chicago. She is an associate professor emerita of American history at Sweet Briar College. She is a U.S. Fulbright Scholar teaching on the social and cultural history of the USA from the American Revolution through World War II. And her current Fulbright project is about the history of American democracy through 1940. So as a Fulbright Scholar, she is currently in Georgia as a visiting professor at the Institute of American Studies at Tbilisi State University. She is therefore lecturing at TSU, IPSU, and other institutes on the above topics. Today, she has graciously agreed to speak with us about a very interesting topic, the development of the media and mass media over time and how this had an impact on U.S. elections since the 1820s. She will also share her comments about the Russian interference in the 2016 elections in the USA. Thank you so much for being here with us today, and let's get started.
Yeah, I'm really honored to be invited to talk with you and your students about elections and the media. This particular presentation, I focus more on elections, but I do mention some of the connections, the integral connections between the media and elections in the 19th century. I have a separate lecture that really opens up those topics, but we will be focusing a lot on the media when we get to the Russian campaign to it's the cyber war that to influence the outcome of the 2016 presidential election. One thing when we talk about American elections, I think it's the first thing to know, especially for people, well, actually for American students, but Georgians and others who do not live in the United States, is that it is the states that handle elections. It's not in the Constitution, but it has been claimed by the states because under some of the provisions in the Constitution, the powers not granted to the federal government are reserved for the states and the people, the states. It's federalism, and the states are really jealous of that particular power. There is no, as we were reminded by one of our US Supreme Court justices within the past decade, there is no federal right to vote. There's only the state right to vote. So there's not really a right to vote directly for the American president. It goes through the Electoral College, which is an anti-democratic institution, has its uses. That's another topic. Okay.
So it sounds like they appeal to the population to maintain to get votes to become the heads of the federal system, but they're not actually in a federal system of elections.
Well, it is, there is sharing, and there are some laws that the federal government has made that that reach into locales, but there are 50 states. And there are, they control, the state governments control certain things like who is eligible to vote. That's in state constitutions. They help to maintain voter registration records. They are involved in ballot, in the creation of ballots. Most elections involve voting for officials at various different levels of government. And these the responsibilities of the state level office of elections includes training local election officials, the voter registration databases, guidance on the testing of voting machines. But the administration of elections, the actual like running of it, it's all is very decentralized. It's all local. So it's counties that cooperate with the state, but it's the county officials who do everything. And this is a source of and let me I have a slide which suggests just how many different governments have elections in the United States. I'm going to share the screen with you, Sarah. It's an enumeration of how many other elections, different types of elections there are in the United States, roughly currently. I don't know what poly-engine is, and I don't know how accurate these are, but it gives you sort of an overall feel for how many elections there are in locales, from counties to municipalities to, I guess the school districts would be in there, how many elected officials there are at the local level, like 500,000. At the state level, almost 19,000. At the federal level, 537. That's probably 537 plus 6 plus 1, namely the president of the United States. That's not the whole government. There's a whole lot of many more who are civil servants who are either appointed, but most of them are hired. And there's usually some kind of exam, usually of some kind. Okay, so I put this together because I wanted to, I did a lecture on election fraud, which is not my topic today, which is not it's very much harder to, election fraud is really actually rare, hard to prove, and rarely swings elections. So we'll come back to that when we get to the Russian cyber war interference in the 2016 election. Okay, so what is true now and in the 20th century is also true in the 19th century, that elections were all handled locally, and in the wake of the actually intense argument between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, who became the Jeffersonian Republicans, parties formed, not so much at the national level because they weren't supposed to do that, but they formed in the states, and they formed and newspapers started popping up, and they were almost all partisan. And the Jeffersonian Republicans, Anti-Federalists, had a monopoly until the successors to the Federalists got wise and started founding their own newspapers. So there were already party organizations at the state level, and it's really at the state and local level. It's during the same period, voting qualifications, the qualifications to be able to vote, which were already pretty widely dispersed in the American male population. About 60 to 70% of the men in America had enough property to exercise the right to vote. But those property qualifications started falling and disappearing even before 1800. Territories that became states didn't want to have property qualifications because they needed population. So they entered the Union without qualifications, and other states started following suit, in large part in search of more votes. And Virginia was, being a very conservative state still, was the last to drop its property qualifications. And I wanted to show you a portrait or a painting by a, oh, one more point, that this was all happening prior to the rise of Andrew Jackson, who and the Democratic Party, the National Democratic Party of the common man. Andrew Jackson was a candidate for presidency in 1824, and he lost. And that changed the relationship between national presidential elections and what was going on at the state and the local level, because communicating, coordinating with the local party organization was what helped to ensure that Andrew Jackson won the presidency in 1829. So even when he was elected, by the time he was elected, the era of the common man had already begun, and it was national politics paying more attention to party organization at the local level. Okay, now I'll show you this painting. Let's see. Let's do it like this. So is that?
Yeah.
You probably couldn't see this very well before, but these are today the breakdown of elections. How many elections there are? There were even more in the 19th century because, as you will see, Americans really enjoyed partisan politics. Okay, so this is a painting by George Caleb Bingham. It was a Missouri politician, a Democrat, and a pretty, really, in both ways. He was belonged to the Democratic Party, and he was an ardent celebrator of American democracy. I'll show you a picture. Do I have it? Whoops. Yeah. Okay. Oh, that's what I got there. Okay. This is George Caleb Bingham in 32-33, which just about when Alexis de Tocqueville visited the United States to understand better. Why is this not going back? No. Ah, there we go. Okay. The Jolly Flatboatmen. These would be the types of men who, once property qualifications went away, had the right to vote. And believe me, they were very proud of it. They were put on an equal level, political equality, with all other native-born or naturalized immigrants, no matter how much money or property they owned. And Republican political culture in that period was it recognized a political equality, that there are many cross-class organizations that men from all different classes would join, such as fire engine companies and hose companies, as well as there were cross-class socializing around courthouses that sort of embodied this, like, we're all independent here. We all have an equal vote. Didn't mean that everyone was equal socially, but by no means. But I like to think that one of the reasons the flatboatmen were so jolly is because they felt pretty viscerally their equality. Now, no property requirements, but it was universal white manhood suffrage. So, of course, no slaves could vote, Native Americans couldn't vote, free Blacks could vote in New York State with a property requirement. But most other places, almost everywhere, free Blacks who tried to exercise the right to vote were blocked at the polls. And of course, traditionally, women were regarded as outside the political sphere, and they were formally excluded from voting by rewriting of constitutions in this period. It seems to be very important for these men who experience equality in the political realm to officially have that realm to themselves, and excluding the women and Black people who were in a hierarchy below them, politically speaking.
I have a question. So what kind of European immigrants were coming in at that time, and were any of them not counted as white, or were they all white by virtue of being European?
This is, they were counted as eligible to vote if they were naturalized. And that's, especially the Democratic Party was particularly good at, getting new voters, getting immigrants naturalized fairly quickly, and then pulling them into party politics. The Whig Party, which is what sort of succeeded the Federalists, was not so good at that type of thing. It was internal improvements. They were really for the state governments and doing things to promote economic growth. The Democrats, not so much. They didn't want the taxes, small government, but they both were staunch supporters of liberal economics, if you will, and their liberal political rights as far as they went. Anything else, Dr. Sly?
I still have to go to graduation to pick up my title, but
I understand.
I have a little letter that says she's completed all the requirements.
I wanted to say a little bit about what the parties did. They became mass political parties, not everywhere at the same time. The South was absorbed this kind of electioneering rather more slowly, but the national parties by 1840 were doing the same things through these local party organizations, which in every small town there was one or two newspapers, and both of them were partisan, and neither of them published the other's political news. This is a Tippecanoe and Tyler too, an election banner, where election banners were generally held at parades or at bonfires or at picnics, along with to which everyone was invited. There were many, many political events that were social in nature, and the whole family attended. Young men were an especially favored position politically, but their sisters and mothers were not excluded. Party loyalty and refilling the party ranks meant that the party organization would give young men things to do, teach them how to canvass, that is, to talk about the party positions, and not necessarily the candidates, but the party positions. And the young men would hand out party tickets. Here, I'll show you what canvassing looks like. It's very, very earnest. Here is not a young man, but a merchant. But this is the kind of political exchange that was typically expected and done during all of these elections, which kept on happening. Tocqueville was amazed and kind of annoyed by how often elections were held and how trivial the issues were to him. This painting illustrates the penetration into boyhood and girlhood culture. There are girls there, but it's the young man who's practicing stump speaking, oratory, because it was the party members rather than candidates who would make these speeches about how important their party and their platform was to the Republic. Children playing. It was like sort of a spectator and a sport that you could hope, if you're a young man, you could hope to become involved in. And you notice that there's an African American looking on. And this is the county election. And you'll see that this banner, it says, the will of the peoples of the supreme law. The fellow who has his hand on the Bible is an Irishman, and he's taking an oath that he hasn't voted elsewhere. He's portrayed in a very positive manner, that he's not later portrayals of and you'll see one of Irish emphasize their best beast qualities as a beast. And there's drunkenness, but there's also, it is a community event. It is a community event. And Bingham is a real fan. I would say that it may be a little bit idealized, but most elections happen in small towns or villages and in rural locales, not in big cities. During that period, 90% of the population lived outside of an urban center of 5,000 souls or more. So these are not even big towns. All right, the county election. I wanted to make a point about how voting, what was the actual process of voting? Voting was in some locales, it was by voice. So you declared your votes out loud, or you handed in the party ticket, that is the ballot, that was printed by the parties. Each party had their own ticket, and it did not include the other parties' tickets, their names. This one is for the presidential election. This is a Free Soil ticket. The Free Soil party was a party in between the Whig Party, and after the Whig Party collapsed, it would take at least a decade for the party turmoil to settle down, and for the Republicans to become ascendant. The reason the Whig Party fell apart was over the issue of slavery. And here are you see the electors for the state at large, and the congressional, the candidates for the Democratic Party, the congressional districts. And so it was very much a public ritual. You'll see that the tickets get much more colorful, so that you could see who was voting for what. And it was a manly ritual. You were stating publicly who you were loyal to, what your affiliations were. And apparently the whole community kind of enjoyed this, but especially on election day, it in the cities, rival party factions would fight to keep the other voters, the other party's voters, from the polling places. And nobody really thought very much about this. It was, I mean, in Boston, and I think 1856 or 50, or I can't remember the date. There were fights at polling places in, like almost in most of the wards of the city. It's like, yeah, that's just again, rough and tumble politics, male politics. And these were the kinds of things that that by the end of the century, reformers were trying to get rid of. And we'll get to that. Okay, so
I have a couple comments before we move
yes.
forward, if possible. So one little notion I picked up probably when I was in my early 20s or something. It just came to my mind at one point. I just thought, people used to be so much more involved in politics because they didn't have anything else to do. And, they didn't have entertainment all the time. They didn't have TV to watch. So they'd go outside and socialize, or it was interesting, and people cared about it a lot. So you basically confirmed that notion to me. I don't know if you would like to add anything to that. And then I have a couple other comments.
Yeah, I think that it is true. I mean, that and religion, especially evangelical, outdoor revivals. Those were the sort of they were both entertaining and serious. Politics, entertaining and serious, and young people were involved in these things. And, young men, John Grinspan, who is a Smithsonian curator and a historian, has written a book about how young women and young men would come to political events. He's read their diaries to meet each other because they wanted to meet men who are in the right party. But the point being that they use these occasions, these political gatherings, as courting occasions. And they were serious about the issues, the party platforms that were formed at state conventions, large, where lots and lots of people from around the state came to the convention, all men, and candidates were forwarded and were chosen, and they also were trained that they had to follow the party platform. There had to be party discipline. It was highly participatory, and for the many competitive elections, competitive meaning that there was a good possibility that one party would displace the other party in the governorship or in the legislature. There was very high turnout, often around 80%. It could drop down to 60% when there wasn't a real issue. But this is true for the entire 19th century until 1900. Okay, the Civil War. It didn't create. I mean, in the wake of the Civil War, wasn't that there was necessarily more partisanship, but the issues got sharper. The issues got sharper, and especially over the extension of political rights through the 15th Amendment to African American men. And here in this particular illustration from Harper's Weekly, just after the Civil War, it's very pro-Republican Party. The African American is depositing his vote, and And the man behind him is a fine, upstanding merchant, an upper middle class supporter of the Republican Party. And these are two, I forgot who they are, but I think one of them is Andrew Jackson. But they obviously are not pleased with the oh, I see. Yes, they're not pleased at the African American who's voting, and the opposite party is advertising itself as the white man's ticket. So the Harper's Weekly is a national magazine that appealed to a middle-class readership and is not necessarily, it was not partisan, it was sort of nonpartisan. But it's interesting to trace the views, the changing views, which are the changing views of a middle-class readership. Okay, so this the intensity of partisan battles for election it gets more intense, and more issues are contested after the Civil War. More issues are contested. It's not just, you know, is the South, are white Southerners going to be able to reestablish some form of white supremacy in the South, which was opposed by the North during Reconstruction. It's why the 15th Amendment was passed, partially. Not just because African Americans had earned it, defending the Union, but also because Republicans needed the votes in the South. But also industrialization and urbanization and the integration of the economy across nationally was making life hard for small agricultural producers, small manufacturers. They're being outcompeted by capital-intensive industries and companies that were sort of buying up smaller outfits. These are some tickets from the Civil War. There were four parties mounted candidates for the president of the United States. Lincoln's won, Republicans won, but with only 40% of the popular vote. And for Georgian students, you're probably, the idea that we would have four parties competing for a national presidential election, it didn't happen in the 20th century. Occasionally there's a third party candidate, but not very often. We'll get to why that is. Yes, go ahead.
About these tickets that you mentioned earlier, it just seems so innocent, like such innocent and trusting times. Like your word was your honor, or something. Like I handed in my ticket.
Yeah,
that would be inconceivable today, but back then there must have been some.
Well, there were no voter registration lists. That registration of voters to make sure that you're an eligible voter, that wasn't really a concept. In part because in these elections, everyone knew, in these small communities, face-to-face communities, you really did know each other. And if there were any questions, you're supposed to bring your credentials if you were challenged. The concern over whether a voter was really qualified becomes more of an issue for some in the post-Civil War period. Here, these colored tickets, again, you hand in this colored ticket, you could write on them, no, I don't want this candidate, I don't want another. I mean, historians have found that tickets are altered by voters, and the alterations match apparently vote counts. I'm assuming, I don't do this kind of research. The greenback ticket. Here's an issue that has to do with the money supply. Both very kind of sophisticated in its way. Many of these local parties in various states, they wanted a bigger money supply. They didn't want it to just be gold, because it meant that when they had to pay their mortgages, it was harder to pay. Money was worth a lot. If they had more money in circulation, it wouldn't be so onerous. Independent taxpayers unions. Where were the state governments spending their money? Were they spending them? This is an issue that's very important to African Americans and poor white farmers after the Civil War, especially in the southern states. Were they spending money on taxes, or was it all for debt repayment? So these economic issues became very, very important. And especially in the South, Black and white voters sometimes joined arms because they found that they had more that they agreed about than they agreed with either of the major parties in their state. So it was a very active time. Political parties can print their own tickets. If you can get people to vote your ticket, you are a player in state politics. It's not that easy today in the United States. Okay, let's see. Okay, and here we see the tenor of coverage of voting issues in the National Harper's Weekly magazine, which appeals to middle class readers, has darkened. Here is the caption: "The ignorant vote, honors are easy." And on the one side, and here, this speaks to your point, Professor Sly, about how the Irish were categorized after the Civil War. Who represents the unqualified vote for the white people? It is a caricature of an Irishman looking rather like an ape, and opposing the Black vote, no shoes, and very cartoonish features. This reflects this worry about qualified voters that gets bound up with other elements of popular politics that look corrupt, and in some cases were corrupt.
This reminds me of the deplorables. What was it? The deplorables comment?
Right. I actually have, I think it was September 7th or something, 2016. It's always bad form in a democracy to demean the voters, but we do it all the time in private. How many times have I heard, my colleagues, say, like, they're just so uneducated, those Trump supporters. They just don't know. If they just knew more. And I can't see disfranchising people because they have different political views and maybe even abhorrent political views to you.
But they have I think the issue is more about different access to the different kind of information they access and different arguments, and they just construct arguments different. I mean, different I don't mean they as in one side or the other. I mean both sides. The other side is often looking at things from a different perspective, constructing different arguments, and also getting different information.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that is they are understanding their choices using social networks and media information that many other voters think is just wrong. But the other example that's really important to think about is when African Americans were disfranchised permanently in the South, it was because the rationale was they aren't educated enough, they aren't civilized enough to exercise the vote responsibly. But everybody is educated to vote their own interest and to decide, what is supporting their own interest. And African American neighborhoods had unpaved streets. They didn't have sewage systems, because they couldn't exercise they had no political leverage. And maybe that is an apples and oranges a comparison, but it just bears remembering. Here, this is weird on my screen. I'm not sure. Can you see the whole thing?
Yeah, if you go out into the smaller visibility, you'll be able to move your picture back onto the screen.
Oh, I see what happened. Yeah, it got moved. Okay. All right. And this is the concern about corruption and voting fraud, election fraud was a national one that but it didn't worry voters. It worried middle-class readers, who I assume they were voting, but it didn't depress voter participation. Let's put it that way. There was the same really high voter participation. In other words, the process of democratic elections, however faulty in this period, were not delegitimized by this drumbeat of, like the Democratic Party in Maine in 1880 tried to steal an election. And here we have fraud, liberty is at stake, counted out. This is the ballot box, which means that the votes that voters had deposited were just put aside. They were ignored. So this was a national concern, but that did not depress voter participation. But it was serious in the South, because
go ahead.
White Southerners used a wider range of tactics to suppress the Republican and the African American vote. I think probably just moving towards wrapping this up. Fraud became as Democrats in southern states became more and more effective at disqualifying African American voters, and they used also the chicken stealing in some states became a felony, because if you were convicted of a felony, you could not vote, and it was thought to be a crime that African Americans committed. Also, vote challenges in some Black majority districts, every single African American vote was challenged. Prove that you're not a felon. Prove that you're this. Prove that you're that. That had a tremendous chilling effect on African Americans who were trying to vote, but couldn't wait 2 days in line. As a result, and African Americans were very, very, and there were opposition parties and who are fighting to maintain a sliver of power all through this period. But essentially, the states became one-party states, and they changed the voting laws to take the management of the vote out of the hands of other parties and regulate who could be in the counting room and who couldn't, and making it possible for only Democrats to be there and for counting out of votes to go on unmolested. In other words, voting fraud was legalized. And yet even that wasn't enough for white supremacists, because they were worried that African Americans were reproducing faster than whites, and they wanted a permanent solution. And they chose a very risky gambit. They held conventions to rewrite their constitutions to eliminate Black voters' eligibility. They didn't want to be questioning their eligibility one by one. They wanted to disfranchise them. It was very risky because poor whites within the Democratic Party understood that they might lose their right to vote as well. And eventually, every Southern state rewrote their constitution, inserting literacy requirements and the requirement that you pay a poll tax, a voting tax, as in order to, and they said this openly in the conventions, in order to exclude Black voters. They also excluded many white voters. So white supremacist elites in these Southern states essentially asked poor white voters to take one for the white team. Okay, and then the last...
That just reminds me about a little bit about who was it? Howard Zinn wrote A People's History of America or something. Mm-hmm. I probably read that 20 years ago at a or just skimmed it, but he did talk about, I remember the one thing that stuck in my mind was about how elites were sort of, I guess maybe mainly in the South, if I recall, were against both African Americans and poor whites. And this kind of seems a little bit like that. It happened in the North too. And because,
this backing up from universal manhood privilege is it's a shift in values from compared to prior to the Civil War. The Jolly Flatboatmen, they probably didn't have much education. They probably didn't earn very much money, but they were thought capable of voting. After the Civil War, if they spoke a different language, or if they were poor and just moved into a northern city, reformers, usually Republicans, were changing voting rules and by implementing registration requirements, and with the express intent of excluding these unqualified voters. Now, when the Democrats got into power, they often would change the registration requirements, so there was party competition that helped to prevent, for example, literacy requirements. But many northern states considered it. That there was a nationwide, and I think that Northerners and Westerners understood what was going on in the South in these terms. Well, of course, whites are excluding Black voters. You don't want unqualified voters to vote. We still, in America, we still live in that era. The successful exclusion of such a large part of the population in the South prior to the passage of the 1965 Voter Rights Act is because of one-party rule. So having two parties in fighting over these rules is overall a good thing if power switches from election to election or every other election, something like this. What I'm showing you here is how the vote changed, how precipitously in the northern and western states and the southern states between 1898 and 1918. This Black area are the core voters. The occasional voters are and the stripes, and the non-voters. There's always a proportion who they just don't bother to vote. Reduces the electorate across the South to 20% of the voting age population. In the North and West, it's reduced by 10% from 70% to 59%. And these reforms being implemented in cities, they're also being implemented at the state level in the North. There is the Australian ballot, the secret ballot, becomes a popular starting in about the 1890s and spreads across America within about 30 years. The secret ballot sort of undercuts the primary ritual of 19th century politics, which was the manly declaration of your loyalties at the polling place. And progressive reformers wanted to get rid of that because they thought it was just the wrong kind of politics. It was irrational. It was not reasoned, and they disliked all of the outdoor celebrations. They just thought that was not really what a voter should be exposed to. So progressive reformers also joined hands with the parties and moved their campaign events indoors, limiting who could be there, and often charging money because they were the era of needing money for campaigns, especially national and state campaigns, was getting underway. And the League of Women Voters, which has done lots of good work in trying to inform voters about what's going on, came into being in the progressive era around I guess it must have been either just before or just after 1920 when the women got the vote, was part of this sort of attempt to rationalize the voting and the political process, get rid of corruption, but it also made politics kind of boring. And the parties didn't mind because having to deal with fewer voters made their jobs easier. Other reforms, like nonpartisan city councils, nonpartisan city managers, all of that takes away there's no patronage jobs There's a civil service exam. It rationalizes administration, which is what governments, that's mostly what governments do, but it also takes popular consent out of it. And that the United States still is living in that era where the fighting over who gets to vote and registration. I mean, it is really a failure of democratic values in my opinion. Okay, so where are we, Professor Sly, and should we move to the 2016 election? Now that I've bludgeoned you and your students into submission. Uh-oh, I can't hear you. What happened?
I said I'll never submit. We have 6 minutes left, so let me make a couple comments and we might banter a second, and then we'll start a new one for the 2016. There's so much information there, and it was truly fascinating. I'm really thankful for this opportunity to learn so much. And it just reminds me, there's different things came to my mind, but one question I had was, I'm still trying to figure out a good definition of the difference between federalism, confederalism, and a unitary state. And I've developed my own understanding of that. But one definition, or one, picture or diagram I saw was something like federalism is where sovereignty is vested in the people, but confederalism is when it's vested in the states. And I wasn't sure that wasn't how I had sort of come to conceive of it. What would be your opinion?
Federalism in the American case it started out as a battle between state level elites and national level elites, both of whom waged the battle for a more energetic national government, for a less energetic national government. They waged it on behalf of popular sovereignty. Better government with a strong national, energetic national government. It would be better government because at the state level, the legislators were too close to the people, and the people sometimes wanted to do things like, I don't know, cancel their mortgages. It really had to do with property in the end. Whereas the Anti-Federalists wanted more power to remain at the state level because they were closer to the people. That was what, and it doesn't mean that these people did not believe in popular rule. They did in popular sovereignty. It's just that it's a power battle between different elites. In the 20th century, federalism shifted because the federal government became much bigger. It got bigger in the Civil War. After the end of Reconstruction, Southern pushback, but also Northern pushback to a degree against, federal control of things was considerable. And the 14th and 15th Amendment were essentially, well, the 14th Amendment was gutted, and a lot of federal level initiatives were stymied by the Supreme Court. But with World War I, but especially World War II, and the growth of the federal government under Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his New Deal changed the equation. A lot of national laws that would not have been passed prior to the 1930s and the emergency of the Depression were passed, and they were all national laws. And the Cold War only accentuated that. The federal government even was, even though there was, there was Republicans, and I think the Democrats, I can't remember who but Eisenhower was the president for most of the 1950s, and he did a lot of things that were national in scope, like the National Roads Act, which sort of connected the whole nation with highways, justified by defense, essentially. And the government foundations grew, funding defense-related priorities. But again, the problem with Jim Crow and excluding African Americans came back to plague the US elite, because communists were during the Cold War pointing out that equality was it was only for some in the United States. And they pointed to the different sets of laws in the South for Blacks and whites. And Brown v. Board of Education was the sort of the legal foundation that it overturned Plessy v. So you're right. Totally, very, very, very tricky. And for the United States, I mean, many of the cases that go before the Supreme Court are exactly about the boundary between state sovereignty. I mean, so it's and federal sovereignty. It seems like a waste. I mean, the federal government is in the United States it's huge, and it taxes us a lot compared to the local governments. And I understand that in some European states, it's the opposite. It's the local government that exacts the most taxes, and not their national government. And in any case, you're right to question it. Okay.
One more point I'd like to bring up before we move on to the 2016 elections is, you mentioned how there's this eternal tension between the state, local, and federal tiers of government and sovereignty, and a lot of the Supreme Court cases are about that. And it seems like there has been a trend towards centralization over the past century, especially. But when you were showing the huge number of local governments and locally elected officials in the first slide, this also reminded me how decentralized we are too. Maybe it's because government has just grown in all, the total volume has grown, and so it's grown in both directions. But the first question would be, are we really on a centralizing? I mean, is this centralizing trend as powerful as it looks on the surface? And is it going to keep going that way, or perhaps bounce backwards towards a decentralizing trend? And another thing that I'd like to start studying organizational theory, and it just seems like the decentralized system is so strong when it's allowed, when it has a possibility to develop. But it just seems like decentralized structures are so much more stable than tyrannical vertical power structures, even though maybe these vertical tyrannical ones are effective in the short term, they're ultimately the more fragile. But I wondered if that, that's just my little impression. I wondered if you had any comments about why or why not that might be the case.
Well, I think insofar as there is a democratic political culture, that decentralization is good because it can involve more people. It can involve more people. There's more ability to exercise to make a political impact if there's some or institutions of self-rule that are local. This can be especially important for resisting authoritarian trends in whatever central government is in the central government of your country. You don't have to have institutions, decentralized local institutions of self-rule, but you have to have some shared experience of autonomous decision making, and in the end, that actually can make democracies, that should make democracies stronger, not weaker. But it also, it causes there's going to be conflicts between the central government and the decentralized, the local governments. Some of those can be controlled by tiers of rules. There's the state can make rules for that, and in the US it differs from how much power does a municipality have, how much autonomy does it have, and how much power does a county have. There's a myriad number of, there are lots of rules, and they differ from state to state. And then there's always the problem of citizens just not wanting to be involved at all, because with decentralized decision-making institutions like school boards, they can be taken over by passionate partisans. But that might, that should stimulate participation from the other side. A contested issue can get people involved anyway. So yeah, it's very, will centralization, I don't know. It differs from country to country. There were some reasons to develop a stronger centralized government, some better than others, but the Cold War was one of them. And
well, that just reminds me of my sort of guesstimation, like sort of attempts to start thinking about this topic, because you need to pull together when you've got a common problem, and then in times of peace, and you can sort of relax a little, and power can go back down. So it sort of suggests that centralization, is useful for certain
tasks.
Certain tasks. It's more efficient in certain ways, but then again, is it ultimately more stable? And it's kind of cool to have a system that can move back and forth depending on the tasks.
Yes, I agree. I also think it takes a population that is interested in being involved, and also has it's not so much the education, but the habits of being involved in certain decision making. I actually, anyway. So I mean,
go ahead.
In the United States, there is a loss of those habits, and it really shows nowadays because people are just yelling at each other a little too often.
Well, this goes back to this question about, should everybody really be allowed to vote? And I definitely understand why there was concerns about, not on racial, I don't even like that word, but not on skin color or racial class category differences, but on intellectual and educational differences. It does seem like, are you sure you want easily manipulable people who refuse to educate themselves running the country? But I suppose that would probably go both ways. Like, it probably cuts down both ways. So in the end, it doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. It can cut in various directions, but so you can't say that all of those are voting are supporting one party or another. But it seems like maybe a more civilized approach to that question would be not, or that issue would be not how can we disenfranchise them, but rather how can we educate them or bring education and encourage such habits. And I don't even mean like, it doesn't even take that much, some critical thinking skills and some media savvy skills. It seems like that would be a better approach than attempting to eliminate people or put them down.
Yeah, and I mean, I've seen proposals for introducing those sorts of measures, but it takes a commitment. It takes a nonpartisan commitment to change the institutions, because that's what you're talking about. It's like different institutions for civic education, and what is that, and how can it be implemented? Which states are going to allow? Is it only blue states that are going to allow that to be implemented? I mean, it's a very sort of blue state. It's a very democratic. The Democratic Party seems more likely to want those types of things, but I don't know. I really can't tell you. I just anyway, I think that it played a role in these issues. Played a role in the 2016 U.S. presidential election.
Also, I think we have to be careful because somebody who's perfectly educated could still make the same kind of mistakes as somebody with a high school education, and they can vote. They can vote just as cynically, and so maybe those things should be encouraged from a nonpartisan perspective. But maybe that, I don't know. I mean, it can only help if more and more people are more and more savvy. And I think
savvy is a good word. Savvy is a good word. It's not knowledge. It's sort of a better feel. And again, these habits of the habits of communication, really.
All right. So
okay.
I'd love to get into the next section. So before you have to.
Yeah. So I don't know what your students are. I mean, one of the problems with the election of 2016 was that the United States and the people they took their eye off the ball. They had forgotten somehow about Russian tactics of, I mean, the government should have known, but it's very, very, I can't imagine, the Ukrainians are very aware of this and have been preparing to protect themselves against cyber attacks and hacking. Citizens in the post-Soviet socialist republics are, they it seems like they'll never, they feel like they know these Russian propensities, if that's the right word, and are dedicated not to never be fooled by them. So, I mean, I don't know if your students have questions about whether this happened. Certainly, the United States and the media discounted Russian interference. They would call it meddling at best. But Timothy Snyder, he argues in this book, The Road to Unfreedom, what were the ideological tools that Putin was using to formulate his imperial aggression, and how did it reach into the United States, as well as Europe? And Kathleen Hall Jamieson argues very specifically about tactics and timing and persuasion. So I have a sort of a series of questions, which please interrupt me at any time, because this is not my bailiwick, talking about, how Putin regards the United States and the EU. I mean, according to Snyder, he sees the West, the EU, and the United States as a spiritual enemy of Russia. That he's been formulating this pan-Slav empire, notion of empire, using materials for Russian nationalist ideologues going all the way back to, I don't know, even before the Russian Revolution. Did the Russian government intend to use misinformation to promote divisions with the potential for causing violence in the United States? Yes, there's lots of information that was the intention, that fomenting war without using weapons or armaments in the United States by Russia would be so cool. This says this think tank called Izborsk Club that included Alexander Dugin, whose daughter was, I think, blown up. He's a Russian nationalist, ideologue, and the fascist novelist Alexander Prokhanov. There are documents that show that they were thinking like that. There are documents from the Russian military that this is like an explicit, explicit goal that is being reached for. I mean, they had previously used misinformation and social media trolling to shape American opinion and that of the legacy news, to adopt the pro-Russian explanation of what they were doing in Crimea, to say, oh, well, to sort of soft pedal it. They hacked the server of the Ukraine Central Election Commission in 2014, were deterred, but I mean, now how about the view of Trump as a manipulable potential asset for these misinformation propaganda campaigns? Yes, they knew that they contributed to his the impression that he liked to foster, that he was a successful businessman, that Russian count. I don't know the terms. Is that there's an institution called let's see, what is it? The Internet Research Agency that works with the SFB, which is Putin's internal intelligence. I mean, that's that network that he comes out of, monitoring Soviet citizens, and also the GRU, which is a military intelligence state operation. They have this sort of agency of cyber nerds who they give tasks to, and they added an American department with staffed by 90 new employees. It's in they're in St. Petersburg, but in 2013, I think it was, and they also hired American operatives who did not know they were being hired by an arm of the FSB and the GRU. They didn't know it. Yes, all these things happen. Give me 1 second. I'm just going to get a little more water. Okay. Russians had long regarded Trump as a man who could be easily manipulated. They promoted his reputation as a successful businessman. They looked at his long record of exploiting socially inflammatory issues that were racially denigrating. You know, Trump campaigned. Trump was a main disseminator of the lie that Obama was not born in the United States, the sort of birther conspiracy. Before that, he accused these African American boys, the Central Park Five, of a brutal beating of a white woman. And it turned out to be untrue. Supporting Trump's election, the intent was there. And did they conduct an extensive hacking campaign, including getting into the various a couple of committees, the Democratic National Committee, and there's one more, hacking, getting emails, and then releasing them at strategic, at moments where either to distract attention from Trump, as when the Access Hollywood tape from 2005, where he bragged about how his status made women sexually available to him, or moments when, or at other points where it really damaged Hillary Clinton's campaign, could really damage Hillary Clinton's campaign. Did coordinated attacks that used stolen material released at a particular time, and then the impact of that stolen material sort of shaped and disseminated through social media. Yes, they did that. The question that is at the center of this is like, well, okay, they hacked, they released, bots on Twitter that took advantage of the retweeting capacity to amplify certain mischievous interpretations of something that Hillary Clinton said, but so what? How do we know how do we know that materially helped Trump to defeat Hillary Clinton, given that she still won the popular vote? She just lost the Electoral College vote. And Kathleen Holds Jameson book, Cyber War, how Russian hackers and trolls helped elect an American president, what we can't do and don't know. I don't usually read titles of books by scholars, or at least not the whole thing, but she, by including what we can't do and don't know, it gives you a flavor of how careful her analysis is. And what kinds of tools, she's bringing to bear communication scholarship about how the news can and cannot, has and has not influenced elections in the past. And then she goes through the tactics sort of in a timeline to map almost the falling fortunes, the diminishment of popularity of Hillary Clinton as a candidate. So it was very coordinated, well-timed steal and release to WikiLeaks, who was perfectly happy to distribute these emails, and then also to using fake sites on Facebook and news sources. There are thousands of them, and also amplifying certain, misleading extracts of what Hillary Clinton said. She demonstrates that real damage was done. It was a massive infiltration of Facebook, unbeknownst to Facebook. It was a massive infiltration of Twitter by fake accounts and bot amplification via trending. Using these social media
now we have the massive infiltration of Twitter by the owner.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I wonder how far the self-destruct spiral will go today. But this Twitter and Facebook, this was all new to them. They did not suspect, which is just, it's kind of, this is a new technology, but it's kind of incredible to me. So divisive messages, that there was and it was micro-targeted. A lot of these pages and Twitter retweets were targeted to specific geographical states that were in contention. It's like we couldn't tell whether Trump or Clinton would win, and also to through the algorithms of Facebook, and also to information that Russians purchased on how to target specific populations. That's the basis of Facebook's mainstream of revenue, advertisements, that they can help a business micro target their ads to best effect, well, the Russians just use that and would, either design divisive like a black impersonating people, impersonating Black Lives Matter, or impersonating or misquoting Clinton and showing her with a that Muslims supported her. Really scurrilous stuff that showed that Russians were paying very, very close attention to what was happening in the United States and the many, many media sources, as well as stealing electoral strategy, tactics and strategy from the Democratic National Committee, from other, Democratic state committees, stealing demographic data that helped them target, and simply following the media's, the traditional legacy media's tremendous fascination with polling numbers, which were identifying hot spots, problem spots, and the Russians just took all of that, paying close attention. Let's say hacked voter model. See, this language is very foreign to me. They hacked voter models from battleground states, including Pennsylvania and Florida, from the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. Access to punditry, toolkits designed to help advertisers identify prospective customers. She also makes some points that while the press isn't very successful at telling people what to think, they are very successful in telling readers and viewers what to think about. So, this speaks to the limits of what is determinable without possibly more extensive real-time polling data or something like that. But the Russians were pushing, think about this, not that. Don't think about Access Hollywood and the nasty, vulgar things that Trump said. Think about how Hillary Clinton said one thing in private to Wall Street bankers, but seems to be saying another thing in public about Wall Street bankers. Can she be trusted? Unfortunately, the mainstream legacy media unwittingly, uncritically picked up a lot of these this language and these talking points at critical junctures in the campaign, and was successful in getting the media and those who are listening to them to refocus on Hillary Clinton and her shortcomings. And the media has admitted fault in the aftermath of this. It's like, oh geez, we just were, the New York Times, we weren't thinking. Sunday morning, the hosts of Sunday morning news shows where important people are invited on, they grilled John Podesta, who was some high muckety-muck in Hillary Clinton's campaign, about whether she was, she looks to be someone who is not reliable. And he didn't have very good answers. So, her conclusion is that the Russians did help to swing the election. But they were also helped by a number of other factors. An electorate that was already polarized and had been primed since 2010 and the Tea Party movement to oppose the Democrats in very, very active ways. There was the American people helped. The legacy media helped by adopting framing and linguistic, phraseology that had been introduced and amplified by the Russians and amplified by social media.
Let's continue.
Okay, I just wanted to flag that last, or at least expand a little bit on that last comment about President Obama, who, I mean, he was warned about this, and in October of 2000, this is 2015 or is it 2016? 2016? Anyway, in October, just before the election, about Russian hacking, and his response, I mean, he had a response. He closed 2 Russian compounds in New York and Maryland and expelled 35 Russian operatives. But he did not call attention to this. He did not call attention to the fact that agencies of the government had become aware of Russian meddling interference, and that the impressions that people were getting had been shaped and actively created and implanted created and disseminated in a manner that was intended to get their attention, get the news media's attention, and to turn them against Hillary Clinton. She was not the greatest campaigner in the world, and obviously the Democratic National Committee, which allowed itself to be hacked, didn't seem to have its act together. But nonetheless, something very serious happened, and all of which has been confirmed by Senate reports, most of which are classified. It was denied at first by Trump administration, but eventually even Trump himself acknowledged it, and that there was serious hacking and took some sort of actions that demonstrated his. And then there's of course the Mueller report, which although it did not it arrived at the conclusion that there was no indictable offenses committed by Trump and Trump's campaign, or at least not any that the Justice Department was willing to pursue. But it did indict, I think it was 19 Russians, some of whom have been tried for being trolls, essentially, being internet trolls. And some of them were deported, some of them went to jail. And so, Jameson has done an incredibly good job. I've never read any academic book that was so focused and so analytically just precise about such an important issue. Anyway, very much recommend looking at her book for a first-rate example of social science. They're much rarer than we would like.
Yeah,
Okay.
I look forward to reading both of those books, and I think they will help me articulate some of my impressions that I've had over the past 10 or 15 years a lot better. And I appreciate you providing a summary, basically, of some of the main arguments here. And I just wanted to add my little contribution. You know, it's sort of like, it reminds me of a detective or something. They have the motive, and they've expressed their intents. You know, they've said we've got a motive, and they've expressed their intent in formal documents. Even if you want to avoid looking at Dugin's philosophy or something, they've expressed their intents.
Snyder does. He's all over it.
Yeah, but even if you don't want to go that route, they've expressed their intent in many ways, and it's documented. You know, they've expressed their fears, which I started to cover in one article, like the Russian perception of the Western threat through an analysis of their strategic documents, which I've only done from 93 to 2000 so far. I've got to do part 2, but I mean, they've expressed who they see as the enemy very clearly. They've made an enemy for themselves, and they've also expressed the intent, you know, to use these kinds of information, I don't know, psychological weapons, I guess, and so on. And the victim's wounds look a whole lot like the kinds of wounds you would receive if you were attacked by such weapons. And you know, it's a serial killer, so we've got similar cases and similar wounds on similar bodies all around its periphery. And you know, I remember being about, how old am I? So by the early 2000s, I was entering my early 20s, I guess. And so, you know, the racial division was there, but there was some kind of air of things moving away, and there was just sort of, I mean, people were just sort of seeming to get along better. It seemed to be encouraged in media. But if I talked to my African-American friends, they would say that there's still problems. And, you know, I would see this too. But there was sort of some kind of integrative processes happening through different parts of society. It seemed like to me, as a young adult, traveling around the country all over the place by myself and going to different places. And then somehow it seemed like something kind of changed, and it started regressing, and people started getting more polarized, and there was lots of hatred. And I remember people attributing this to the rise of social media, and in one sense that's true, and in that more people were able to express their opinions, and before they didn't have such avenues of expression. So that's naturally going to bring out a lot of dirty laundry and bring up old grudges and skeletons in the closet. But it just felt like somehow this was being manipulated, and somebody was pushing polarization and division in the society as well. And later it just seemed to me that must have been the Russians all along, at least in part. And then I also remember sort of observing the rise of, you know, because I was sitting writing a master's thesis in my room in Tbilisi. So I'd just go through YouTube and stuff like that. And I started seeing all this conspiracy stuff come up, and blog talk radio and YouTube channels. And I just would entertain myself by listening to all of them. And I started noticing this it just sounded like Russian narratives to me. And I started getting quite concerned that they were infiltrating our subconscious through these conspiracy theory type regular guys talking, and Alex Jones and stuff like that. And the interesting thing about that movement is it evolved over time. At first it was, we distrust the authorities and we can't trust the establishment. And then it turned in, we can't trust the Democrats. And it's almost like they corralled a certain, they convinced a certain demographic to stop trusting reality at all. Like the universe is not what you think.
And that's a very totalitarian strategy if you can get people there. I mean, but here in America, in a free society, it's like, wow.
Well, I mean, it works anywhere because people are people, and we all have a similar psyche somehow architecturally. But like, it was this. Well, I call it. So I'm going to say this online now. Hopefully, no one. I can patent it now. I think I call it antimatter universes, like, or what is it? Now I forgot my catchphrase. But like, just like you have antimatter universes, now we've got reality and anti-reality universes. So you've got one universe of, people trying to basically see things as they are, attempting to, doing their best. And you have an entire, it's literally just the opposite. It's the polar opposite. It's the antimatter universe, where every single claim you make, there's a counterclaim. Every single claim about reality, there's an opposite reason why that's a lie. And it's having been raised in a cult where they trained you to have an answer for everything, you basically have this anti-reality universe created, and there's an answer to everything that could possibly come up. And people are constantly obsessed with this. They're watching this. They learn more and more details, so that anytime anybody says, here's a fact, or here's an alternative viewpoint, oh, you're a sheeple, they have their own special language. This is also a feature of cults. There's I'm not saying it is a cult. I'm just saying there's certain mind control, brainwashing aspects that you can find in there that, well, you're a sheeple, or you didn't have, their own code language, I don't know, red pill or different colored pills. And then there's an answer to everything. And ultimately, and then there's constant messaging, constant exposure to this messaging.
Yeah.
And so you're always getting this reinforcement. And then it's all, I don't want to go too far down this road, but it's emotional, not logical at certain points. And you get, what was I going to say? This, it's I don't remember exactly what I wanted to say, but something probably along the lines of, you've basically got this entire worldview built up in your mind, and it's the complete opposite. And then of what's actually happening. And so you can't take in new information, or, you maybe you can eventually, but it sort of walls off other information. And so everything is interpreted according to this paradigm. So you got that paradigm, and you've got that. Well, CNN or BBC said this kind of news thing. Yeah, but that's the manipulation tool of the lizard elites or something, So you just have this in every level, in every sphere of thinking. And I noticed that kind of taking over our national subconscious in, as you said, not everybody's mind, but a specific micro targeting. And this moved into this movement turned anti-democrat, and then it turned anti-Clinton. And I just thought, oh my goodness, Alex Jones is going to get Trump elected. And it's and I remember telling my dad and some family members, and they're just like, oh, we can handle this, this is nothing. And well, we almost didn't handle it. I mean, we had a coup. It was a very close election in what was it, last time we had an election, 2020. So and meanwhile the whole society is growing increasingly polarized. I don't know, as an historian, maybe we've always been so polarized, but it seems like there's been a lot of help in getting us polarized.
Yeah, I mean, the saturation of certain sectors of American society and culture with these types of messages. It does feel, I mean, it feels a little bit new, although I suppose if you are a Russian revolutionary or someone who was really involved in the discussions, the international discussions about socialism and communism and strategy, like political strategy and things like that. It seems like there's a wider net is being cast because of talk radio, because of the internet and social media than ever before. I'd like to think that these people are that people who join the cult are isolated and but I don't think isolated, and that's why they're like socially atomized, and that's why they batten on to these ideas. But but a few words I want to say that the elections in 2020 and 2022 in America, they went well, and I strongly doubt that American elections, or at least that I strongly doubt that Russians will have a similar success for a while, or ever. The problem is the American people, as you say, enough of them are primed to take in conspiracy theories. That is our problem.
But I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I would blame ourselves entirely, but
no, I don't. I think that there's no, absolutely not. Some Democratic institutions did really well during all of this, and during the subsequent elections. So it's a very complicated situation.
But along with this sort of this really terrible polarizing tendencies just on every topic, like I don't see people looking for compromise solutions anywhere. It's just really polarized or black and white or something in so many different areas of discussion. But along with that, I just see sort of through time, I had seen Russian narratives kind of seeping into the arguments. And then this results in lawmakers getting elected who are promoting Russian arguments. And then that further legitimizes these narratives, like, why are we wasting our money saving Ukraine? They should solve their own problems, or whatever they're saying. And I just another just one of these traditional counter arguments, that already prepared, they saw it somewhere on Facebook or social Reddit or something, they can repeat it back out. Well, we didn't need the Russians' help, it's all our own fault, we did this to ourselves. Well,
oh no, there needs to be action taken to oppose these sorts of these Russian cyber war campaigns. You can't just like lay back and say, well, we'll give therapy to those in the Republican Party and the MAGA Republicans.
No, we need a better thinking. And also, you were mentioning something about I really like them. I'm sort of doing a little research on the Georgian elections, just superficially.
Mhm.
And I was looking at all the survey data and poll data, and I was like, oh, this is, I mean, I'm still figuring this out, but there's lots of neat, stuff you can figure out there, and who you can target and who you can message, especially if you've got a very small margin that you want to just keep, that all you need is a small margin or something like that. And so I thought it was interesting that you mentioned this, the Russians were really interested on that and focusing on that. And we need to keep that in mind when we're thinking about their tactics in the future for our country, which is not immune, and for the countries in the periphery when their elections are coming. We should be savvy to what they can do, and take what we learned from the US elections to future elections all around the world. And the other thing you mentioned, which was interesting, was the timed release of certain materials. And it reminded me of the 2012 elections in Georgia, which I'm not saying this, I'm not comparing it I'm not comparing it as an analog. I have not researched that, and I don't know exactly what happened, but the only part I'm comparing is how effective that can really be, because it was about, if I recall correctly, about 10 days before the election that really scandalous and horrific tapes, suddenly appeared. And this, as I recall, it did seem to basically swing the election in the Georgian dream direction. I don't know if I don't know if at this point whether they would have won anyway or not, but it was a very big scandal, and it probably had a big impact on voters.
It had, some, yes, yeah, I see what you're saying.
So that can be quite an effective tactic if we think about a dramatic case.
I mean, and Jameson would completely agree with you.
And I'm not saying they did it on purpose or something. I'm not saying, I don't know if it spontaneously appeared or anything. I just, such events certainly can have an impact. Please continue.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I hope that the Democratic Party and its various organizations, various political organizations at the national level who are supporting, I don't know, strategies for their candidate or candidates are much more savvy about what they're doing. Because, that the Russians, they did try to they hacked into about 40 local and I think it was local state election sites. They didn't get anywhere because none of the voting machines are connected to the internet anymore. But that's a lot of hacking work, and it's everyone needs to get more savvy.
Yeah, and I meant to sort of end my little comments there with, like, I think with some of our over focus on these little technical things, like did they hack or did they leak, or in our I don't know, maybe overconfidence in our abilities to withstand things, and our underestimation of Russia, which seems to be chronic.
Yes.
We're always missing we're repeatedly missing the bigger picture, and we're really, really missing the just rabid, I guess, hostility of an enemy that we continue not to take seriously, and I think will continue to try to disrupt whatever it can, however it can. So I hope we take it, I hope we really take it more seriously. I think you have to go. I just realized it was 4.
Yeah, I do. But I want to thank you for this discussion.
Thank you.
And I hope that we can get together in another session if you wish.
Yeah, I'd like
on
to.
American history of American media, and it was a pleasure to be invited.
Yeah, I hope we can meet again. And so I'm glad you offered. And I think this is great for Georgians, Americans, and everybody. I really enjoy hearing your knowledge and wisdom. So very informative. So have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Sarah. And I will be in touch.
Me too.
All right.